Hi, everybody. My name is Louis Mingon. I'm the webinar host for the Canadian Society of Environmental Biologists. And we have a guest tonight. We do webinars every year. And I have a non-cooperation on my... Okay, so our guest tonight is Tal Engel. He's a forester working out of his farm, Honey Grove Farm in Merville, and he does work on Salt Spring. I'll let him present himself. So we'll flip over to you. I'll make you the presenter now, Tal.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
So yes, welcome everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank Louis and the Canadian Society of Environmental Biologists for hosting this evening and giving me this opportunity to present this body of work before all of you. So so thank you for that. So Louis, are we good to go? Should we?
We're good. You're up. We see you. We see your face, and I've disappeared.
Yes, and the slides are on the screen and everything. Okay, sounds good. So the topic of our discussion tonight is, as it says here, ecological climate adaptation. So transforming tree farms into forests. So you'll notice two things. First of all, there's many kinds of climate adaptation. Here we're going to talk about climate adaptation that also has ecological benefits, and just a little something to notice, the difference between a tree farm and a forest. That's something that we'll talk about as well. That's the art and science of restoring ecologically dysfunctional ecosystems to natural and resilient states. Okay, so without further ado, let's get going. So the structure of our talk tonight, I'll just move something around here. Okay, so this is the structure of our presentation. So we're going to start with some historical and ecological context. That's going to be part one. And part two is going to be an overview of research and existing methodologies. So there's been a lot of work, of course, in the field of ecological restoration of forests, and we're going to do a relatively brief overview of that. And in the third part, which is going to be our main part, we're going to look at the restoration regime that I've been working on for the past few years, and that's going to be the majority of our conversation. So I just want to say, this is going to be a conceptual presentation. So really, we're not going to get into anything nearly as deep as we should. We're just going to be going over the concepts, but we do have a discussion period at the end, and it's not limited in time. So as far as I'm concerned, I can be here until the morning, until the last of you is satisfied and every question is answered. So yeah, be sure to write down what you want to talk about and any slides you want to go into more deeply at the end. So I'll just start with a little bit of background about myself. So again, my name is Tal Engel, and I'm originally from Israel. I've lived in Canada for 6 years, and I live on a land that we call Honey Grove with my daughter. You can see her on the right there with a volunteer in a wheelbarrow, and my wife and our 2 dogs. And yeah, this land really has taught me almost everything that I know. And I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's true. Many of the ideas that we'll be discussing today have come from things that I've observed in the forest and things that I've learned while working with this land. So yeah, what we do here is, well, we practice regenerative farming and permaculture. So we have 1,000 apple trees. We keep bees, and I also practice what I call regenerative forestry. So it's important to understand from the beginning that everything that I'm going to be presenting, even if it seems quite groundbreaking in the realm of forestry, or at least quite new when applied in forests, it lays on a pretty firm foundation. Permaculture and all of the associated bodies of knowledge and methodologies have been around for a long time. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about relies on these time-tested ways of thinking. just want to mention a couple of important collaborations. So Transition Salt Spring is my biggest collaboration. So that's an organization on Salt Spring Island. Actually, the director of that organization and her husband, so Dr. Ruth Waldeck and Dr. Pierre Minot, are here today. Yeah, we have a large experiment array that we're working on and testing some of the methods as part of their larger project to restore part of the watershed there. And I'm also working with Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. There's going to be, at the end of the talk, there's going to be a link to a feature article that they published about parts of this work. And there's also forests that they've recently acquired on Pender Island, and both Transition Salt Spring and Rain Coast, we're in the process of developing a restoration prescription that relies on these methodologies and others. And so before we really get into the material, I just want to say that having a little daughter at this time, it's a pretty scary thing. I always wonder what kind of world she's going to grow up in, and that's one of the main drives. Of course, the love and care for the forest and the land itself is a big one too, but they're just concerned about the future and the world that she'll grow in is a big motivation. And I guess on the overall, my dream is one day to have an organization that does forest restoration on a large scale. So applying the methods that have been developed on this land here on Honey Grove and on a larger scale. So let's start with a really hard question, and I think it's in everyone's mind after this past year and in general after these last few years that we've experienced here on global scale, but really BC has been hit hard. So let's ask, are we prepared? Climate change, it's already here. So it's not that it's coming, or I think it's very apparent that the reality is already, it's very much a tangible reality. So let's look at some of the conditions that we have stepping into this reality. So first of all, well, old growth forests are a tiny fraction of our land, and even then they're disappearing. Second and third growth forests. So younger forests are being cut at extremely fast rate. If you look here in the Comox Valley where I live, Mosaic is cutting our watershed. They're just clear cutting the whole watershed. As the fires this year also show, our forests are tinderboxes. So there are many reasons, we'll go into it, but our forests are incredibly flammable. And in the context of climate change, that's concerning, of course. And drought and flood cycles are all but guaranteed. That also has a lot to do with our forest management and biodiversity collapse. I mean, pollinators get a lot of attention, but extinctions are basically a regular thing now at this point. And of course, there's a question of carbon, smoke, pollutants, and their effect on society and ecosystems. So I believe that the answer to this question is no. It's a resounding no. We've bred the perfect storm coming into this epoch of climate change. And it's almost like we've self-sabotaged on purpose so that we come into this really tenuous era in a pretty tenuous ground. So let's look at them. I'm sure you all remember, but just a quick overview. So 2021 and 2022, we didn't get any rain from July until mid-December. We lost almost every single bee colony. And I mean, I don't know if you've seen these images of the salmon from Bella Bella, but yeah, it's quite heartbreaking. And we got snow here before we got any rain. And that's, I guess, quite unprecedented. 2023, well, there isn't really that much to say. We're still in it. So I'm sure that, yeah, we're still in the throes of it, and we're all very aware of how bad it is and how much it's exceeded all of our expectations. So for me, this work in the forest, working to regenerate forests, restore ecological functionality, and I guess ecologically do climate adaptation, it's more than an occupation. For me, it's just something that allows me to live with myself in a time where it's not easy for people with conscience who care about this planet and its ecosystems to live with themselves. And so it's really an attempt to find hope. And yeah, so let's have a quick look at the ecological context and how we got to this kind of state, especially here in BC. So of course, climate change is a big one. Fire suppression is another topic that gets a lot of attention. And The third part of this is our forest management over the last 120 years since European settlers arrived here. And there's an elephant there because it's a bit of an elephant in the room, because yes, it gets some attention, but really the first two get far more attentions in the context of fires, floods, droughts, than does this third one. So this third part is going to be the focus of our discussion. And it's one thing that is really at the basis of all of this is the understanding that diverse ecologically functional forests are incredibly resilient, and they can buffer and mitigate many of these disasters that we're facing. But of course, we don't have many of them. So let's ask ourselves, let's have a look at how we got to the situation. So where's the money? That's a question that no one really likes, but it's a very informative question when it comes to understanding anything in our money-crazed society. So if we ask where's the money, well, when it comes to forests and lumber, the money is in uniform lumber with minimum knots and at stands with maximum productivity, which means overdense monoculture, homogeneous stands, and they're often referred to as working forests. And Lewis said something the other night that I thought was quite funny and sad. He said, well, if they're working, then they've worked themselves into a cardiac arrest. So I think that's it's quite true. And I refer to them typically as tree farms because really they're not forests. And we're going to look now at the ecological characteristics of old growth versus these tree farms. They're basically the forest version of a canola field or a wheat field out in the prairies. So these stand conditions create vulnerable and ecologically barren, albeit lucrative, and that's if they don't burn, stands. So now a comparison. I think these pictures actually speak very well for themselves. We'll also go a little bit into a comparison of the characteristics, but I mean, my partner, when she saw the photos underneath, she asked me why I'm putting black and white photos in the presentation. So of course they're not black and white, and you can see that, but it's quite a stark contrast between, on the top, you can see one of the most lush, productive ecosystems on the face of this planet, which is, of course, the old growth temperate rainforest, and one of the most life-nourishing, life-sustaining ecosystems. And at the bottom, it's a barren, it's a wasteland. Doesn't do almost anything except for produce lumber. And let's have a look a little bit at the difference between these two when we break it down. And this can be the topic, of course, of a whole series of lectures, so we won't go into it too deeply, but it's important to understand because these old growth characteristics are our aim. So every ecological forestry regime is designed to try to move from this kind of barren, uniform condition to a more complex, resilient, diverse one. So keep in mind what we're going to be talking about when it comes to old growth forests, because that's going to inform everything that we talk about today. It's an attempt to go from these photos at the bottom to these photos at the top. And of course, getting to the top takes hundreds of years, but at least to set our forests in the right direction. So, okay, let's look at old growth forests in the context of fire. So they have very open canopies, view loads are low, their densities are low, and they have a very complex structure. And all this means that there is at no point the same kind of fuel continuum into infinity that we get with our kind of plantation forests or tree farms. And also in an old growth forest, in an old forest, we have thick trees. So a Douglas fir that's huge, like all these trees that we know and love, it can have a bark that's this thick. And that kind of tree will be able to withstand extreme fires. And these forests are also incredibly moist. In contrast, tree farms are polar opposite. It's basically a fuel continuum. So if you look at the canopy is completely closed, a lot of ladder fuels, a lot of ground fuels. The extreme competition means that there's very high mortality, and they're also very dry. So talking about dry, let's look at water and hydrology. So these old growth forests, and this might be the most crucial difference really. It's the way that old growth affects hydrology and what happens when we replace these kinds of old growth forests with these types of tree farms. So old trees are very efficient. They have deep roots. They have low evapotranspiration. They can control their stromatas. And there's a lot of coarse woody debris. So CWD henceforth, but that's coarse woody debris. So those are large snags, large nurse logs. There's also a lot of soil organic matter. So all of this means that there are huge carbon sponges that hold tremendous amounts of water and intercept rain and water as it goes down the watershed, basically like natural dams. Contrast, tree farms are very, very thirsty. So these young trees have a high sapwood to heartwood ratio, and they're just growing so fast that they take up almost all of the water. They don't have a lot of moisture retention in general. There isn't much coarse woody debris or organic matter. And there's one study from 2017 that found 50% reduced flow rate in a watershed dominated by a tree farm compared to an old growth watershed. So pretty shocking. And then, of course, biodiversity. I mean, these photos say it all. So old growth forests are incredibly diverse. They can sustain many kinds of organisms with all the ecosystem niches they have, and that has to do with the tree structure, the coarse woody debris, so the large snags, the large nurse logs, the very established understory. And I just want to emphasize understory because that's one of our main management goals. If you'll look at these pictures again, you'll see there's nothing on the ground. And the understory is where the interface between the forest and most of the animals and other plants happens. So getting understory again is a hugely important goal. And of course, the tree farms, there's not much growing there except for Douglas firs, and even they're not doing that great. And okay, so that's a lot of grim and a lot of grimness because really the situation is not simple, and we all see it. Every year now and every season we can feel how things are not right and nature is out of balance. But I still believe that there is hope. But the time to act is now, and we have to act swiftly and decisively. We're almost too late. We might be too late, but who knows? At least we better give it a shot and try and do something because the way things are going, it's not looking great. So let's look at a few of the. Let's look at what I see as what we can do. So protecting whatever old growth remnant we have, it's a noble and worthy goal, and I think it's moral. But where our fate will be decided really as a civilization is what we do with the vast majority of our ecosystem, which is dominated by young forests and clear cuts. So what are we going to do with our clear cuts? So first of all, if we replant these clear cuts and we keep replanting them as these tree farms, we're just going to hit the same kinds of problems. So we need to plant less densely and more diversely. And this is emphasized because really this is what I believe to be the most important missing link. Rather than culling them and mowing them down, we have to work to restore second and third growth forests on an unprecedented scale. And that's going to be a gargantuan challenge, but that this is what the vast majority of our land is dominated by. So that's where our fate really will be decided. There are existing models, like I mentioned in the beginning, for ecological restoration of forests, but they have some limitations, and we'll go over them further down. And those limitations are really what informs this regime that I'm presenting to you tonight. It's an attempt to bridge these gaps. Okay, so that's the end of part one. Let's get into part two, research and existing methodologies. In the picture here, by the way, you can see a single repetition of a LSSE. It's a large-scale silvicultural experiment. You can see that it's a density management study. It's a huge, enormous study where they've looked at many, many different variables. And I think it's just an interesting picture. So let's look at the foundation for this kind of work in general. So ecological forestry, contrasted with commercial forestry, is interested in getting these old growth characteristics and restoring forests, at least getting some of the characteristics to an old growth state and to start getting some of those benefits. So we have to understand how these forests developed historically, these old growth forests. So first, what does it take to grow an old growth forest? Well, of course, it's time. I mean, it's called an old forest. We don't have a lot of time, but still, time is one of the most important things. But even given time, kinds of forests that we have, based on this body of research, will not develop many of the essential characteristics of these old growth forests. Of course, then there's the question of survival. Will these forests survive? How many millions of hectares have burnt this year? Yeah. So we're not going to get those complex crowns, these strong trees, the multiple canopy layers, and the biodiversity. We're going to have many, many missing actors. So if we want, we need to understand what we're aiming for so that we can start change our forests. So let's look at some of the crucial findings from this body of work. So first of all, they found that just like with humans, growth that has not taken place at a young age will never take place in the same way, even if you compensate later in life. So the largest trees, 300, they're the ones who started fast. So when they were 30, they were growing fast already, which of course our trees are growing very slow in our tree farms due to very extreme competition. And these old growth forests, these trees, when they looked at the rings, they found that they developed very rapidly for over 100 years. And again, contrast that with a tree farm that gets this canopy closure and stem exclusion. After all, something like 30 years, you get just a crash. If you don't do a thinning, the growth rate crashes. So they also had long establishment periods. The trees started over a long period. And this is something that I think is quite surprising. It's that competition was not a major driver of these stands development. Well, I mean, in our forests, competition is everything. And maybe that's a reflection about our society where we create these kinds of conditions for ourselves as well. But in these old growth forests, inter-tree competition was not that big of a driving factor. And when they did modeling to compare, okay, at what kind of density will forest that's planted today, grow at the same rate as an old growth forest when it was young. So they found 125 to 135 stems or trees per hectare. Well, do you know how many trees we plant per hectare in our tree farms? It's 1,600. It's 1,200 to 1,600, but most of our forests were planted at 1,600, and that's before natural regeneration starts to take place. So our forests are incredibly dense compared to where they need to be if we want to get those same kind of trees and characteristics that we see in these old growth forests. So another kind of shocking finding is that even delayed cohorts, so trees that established up to even 100 years after the first cohort of trees established, these trees growing under taller trees still grew faster than the fastest and largest trees that we get in our plantations. So conclusion is that if we want to start seeing some of those benefits, we have to change the developmental trajectory of our forest. And that means early and heavy density reductions. There's of course much more to it, but that's a really, really, really important place to start from. And if we don't start there, we're not going to get into any of the other areas that we're interested in getting to. So there is a very firm foundation for this kind of work, for this thinning work. I guess you can call it ecological thinning. And there has been a lot of research about something called variable density thinning. So here on the left, you can see this top to bottom view, and at the right, you can see the same thing, but from a frontal view. So let's talk about this thinning. And again, thinning is a massively important topic, but we're not actually going to go into it that much now in the discussion. If you're interested, just bring it up. We can go into it more, but thinning really is what determines the success of the entire treatment, but it is an existing body of work that is quite effective. So we're going to focus more on some of the new methods and approaches that I want to propose and that are being experimented upon. So these kind of treatments, these ecological thinnings, they're based on a body of work called large-scale silvicultural experiments. These are very, very big thinning experiments or density management experiments in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and they cover thousands of hectares. They've been studied in hundreds of studies, and yeah, they're also there's a lot to talk about there. But that's where, when I talk about the existing methods, mostly I'm referring to findings, methods, conclusions from LSSEs. So first of all, I want to just differentiate commercial and ecological thinning. So commercial thinning is generally even space, and the goal there is to reach canopy closure again as fast as possible, because they want to get that uniform lumber that doesn't have those knots. So you do a thinning, but it's very light, it's very uniform, and it generally has very limited benefits ecologically. It's a silvicultural approach, whereas the ecological thinning is polar end, the polar opposite. So even though often there is a harvest that happens, it aims to create complex conditions that can provide many ecological benefits. So old growth characteristics are at the center of it, of course. Like I said, that's at the core of everything. And there's also an element of resource redistribution. So by thinning these very dominant overstory trees, we can get the understory, we can get some of those shade-tolerant conifers, these deciduous trees, everything that we want to establish in terms of biodiversity. We can get them to succeed because we're reducing, well, we're letting in more light, we're leaving more water for all the other organisms, and there's more nutrients. And of course, there's also a large effect on hydrology. Like I said, these tree farms are very thirsty. These thinnings are also, they also reduce the fire risk if they come with a fuel treatment, and of course biodiversity, like I mentioned. So there's three elements to a VDT treatment. So gaps, they're large openings, and they cover 10 to 20% of the area. So here's a couple of examples of gaps. The second are skips. Those are large areas that are not thinned. So if you're starting to get the gist of it, the idea is to create high variability in structure so that you get many ecosystem niches and it's the same kind of complexity. We're trying to imitate the complexity of old growth forests. And the third one is the thinned matrix. So that's basically an area that's thinned in a more uniform way. Keep that in mind because one of the methods we'll talk about does relate to the matrix. But like I said, overall, this body of work is quite effective. These thinning treatments, they've been studied extensively. They do what they set out to do very well. When we'll talk about the limitations of existing approaches, it's really what thinning alone can't achieve, because thinning alone can achieve many things, but it can't achieve everything. So another method that's very commonly practiced is underplanting. So that is called underplanting because you're planting under an existing canopy of trees. This is something that's done in conjunction with a thinning treatment. You're basically capitalizing on this increase in resources and in these openings that you create. So why do it? Well, I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. Any kind of ecological restoration project usually involves some kind of native species planting. It's a really important thing. So if the seed sources are very far, that these organisms won't make it naturally. So you're bringing back organisms that are absent sometimes from very large areas. Here you can see my daughter running with 2 cedar seedlings and planting one with one of our volunteers. And some of these more important organisms are first the shade-tolerant conifers. There's hemlocks, cedars, grand firs, white pines, and I mean the blight-resistant kind. And then there's deciduous trees, and I think the big leaf maple is the most important of them because it's the only one that is semi-shade tolerant, semi-drought tolerant. But there's many other important deciduous species, and many of these absent actors in our forests have a tremendous impact when it comes to wildlife, when it comes to hydrology, soil building. So we really want to get these present in a significant way so that we don't finish with another kind of monoculture forest. And then of course there's planting of shrubs, herbs, forbs. So I just want to quickly go over 2 other existing methods. So these are habitat and forage creation methods. So instant snags, this is an existing method where a tree is girdled. These 2 photos are from my land, but this is pretty commonly and widely practiced. So sometimes you girdle a tree, kill it standing up rather than fall it down, so that you can provide the cavity nester habitat, so you can provide that kind of primary decomposer like the woodpeckers and the boring beetles and forage. And so it's basically a way to reintroduce one of those missing old growth elements. And log distribution, so many times trees are fallen down, they're cut so that they adhere to the ground and they have good ground contact so that they decompose well. So these are 2 existing methods for creating some of those ecological benefits. So if we look at this whole kind of body of work of existing methods and talk about what it does well, so the benefits that and everything that when I talk about the benefits and limitations in the next slide, it's all based on the conclusions of the authors and researchers themselves from these studies. So one of the things that these treatments have done well, it's stand variability. So a complex structure has been reestablished, and that's really important because structural manipulation opens the door for any other kind of impact that we have. So canopy layering and complexity, so trees with longer crowns and more canopy layers, that's another really important old growth characteristic. That's something that increased. Post-thinning mortality was negligible, even in very, very severe thinnings. And wind throw, which is the largest concern, wasn't a major problem. So that's encouraging. It shows that even though we're altering these tree farms quite drastically, these trees are still strong enough to handle it. And the overstory that we leave will generally handle it quite well. Of course, there are certain sites that are more exposed, but that's an encouraging sign. And also, there were dramatic reductions in mortality compared to the control. So all of these trees that we thinned are trees that we take out from the mortality pool, which would have died, as we see in the control, in their hundreds or thousands sometimes per hectare. And that has a large role, a large impact when it comes to fire, because all of these trees that die just end up piling into mountains of fuels and to this fuel continuum. So another finding was that gaps were essential. So these larger gaps, they provided enduring and significant variability and biodiversity. So they're crucial. And the regeneration of the underrepresented species, so these shade-tolerant conifers, these deciduous species, these understory species, they really catapulted after the thinning treatment, after the variable density thinning treatment specifically. And that's also good because we want to underplant. So the trees we underplant and shrubs, they have a good chance of doing well. And we saw an accelerated growth in all of our overstory trees, except for the largest ones. And that is actually important. So let's look at the limitations. So this is a really important slide. And actually, when we get to our conclusion, our final slide, we'll look at this table again, because these limitations of the existing methods are in many ways what has motivated this new approach, and it's what informs it. So it's the attempt to bridge these limitations and gaps is at the heart of everything. So first of all, the most significant limitation identified by basically every single author and researcher is continuity. So when we look at our forests, typically Douglas fir forests, because that's the cash crop, and they're so dynamic, they grow so fast after a thinning that even a severe thinning treatment will not yield long-lasting benefits. So these forests, on average, close between 1.5% to 2% per year, and that doesn't sound much, but in 20 years, they close 40%, and that's basically what you're going to be opening in a thinning treatment. So you need to do multiple treatments, and that's a huge problem, because if we're looking at the scale where this problem exists, it's a scale of millions of hectares. So if we need to do even one treatment, it's quite unfathomable, let alone many treatments come back every 10 years. This is one of the biggest limitations. Another really important one is that coarse woody debris volumes were largely unchanged. So that is one of the most crucial old growth elements that are missing. So the dead wood is no less important than the living wood. And if we can't provide, and when it comes to hydrology, I just want to emphasize it is especially important. So if we want to provide those old growth habitat, hydrology, benefits, we need coarse woody debris. And existing methods, they don't do that well enough. They also have a limited effect on soil health and nutrient content, which is another crucial problem. So 120 years of industrial forestry have left our soils quite poor. Limited effect on hydrology, well, the impact of this can't be overstated. So like I said, 50% reduced flows in some of these watersheds covered by tree farms. And that is a huge problem. And of course, with no water, there is no life. And that is something that one of the main things that I look at when I try to create these kinds of new methodologies. And so there was also another problem with the growth of the largest trees. And maybe it doesn't sound like a big problem, but when you think about old growth forests, the first thing that comes to mind are huge trees. So if we can't accelerate the growth of the largest trees, and the reason that they're not growing faster is that they're already above the competition. So thinning alone can't accelerate their growth. So if we can't get them more water, if we can't improve their soil, they're not going to grow faster. And if they don't grow faster, we're going to miss the most foundational characteristic of an old growth forest. And of course, fuel management is also a problem. There are not many solutions available, and we'll look into this in more detail. So these are all crucial shortcomings. Like I said, there are many things that the existing methods do well, but these are crucial shortcomings that affect the feasibility, ecological functionality, and survival chances of our forests. So they're the motivation behind this regime. And really, this is something that's both exciting and also a little bit overwhelming because of the scale of the challenge before us. But ecological forestry is still in its infancy. Here in BC, you're not going to see much of anything except for clear cutting. And even though there have been some experiments, especially in the United States, still there's so much ground to cover. And so, yeah, it's a vast new frontier. So looking at these limitations, now we're getting to the third part of the talk, the third and final part of our talk, where I'll be presenting the restoration regime that I've developed. So the reason I refer to it as regenerative forestry, of course, it's quite self-explanatory. It's an attempt to regenerate these ecosystems. And I call it holistic because there are many elements in it that work together. And before we really talk about the regime itself, there's a really important distinction that I want to make. So let's start with agricultural models, because really what informs forestry models are agricultural models. And if you look into this a little and think about it a bit more, you will come to the conclusion that our industrial forestry practices are 100% informed by our industrial agriculture. So let's just look at the foundation. This is, again, a huge topic. I would love to have a whole talk about it, but let's look at just the philosophical premise at the base of industrial agriculture first. So one, nature is inherently flawed. Science will fix and improve it. Two, civilization exists outside, above, and beyond ecosystems. And this kind of thinking, it permeates into everything that we do, from our monocrops to our reliance on herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, to our intensive harvests and suppression of natural processes. And this is what informs industrial forestry, which is the kind of forestry that landed us in the situation that we're in today, this kind of tree farm or plantation forestry. So in contrast, let's look at regenerative agriculture. So the philosophical premise of this is that one, nature is the fount of all wisdom. That alone, which has sustained life from the beginning of time, can sustain us. And two, civilizations are embedded within ecosystems and are altogether dependent upon their integrity. And this is what inspires this regenerative forestry approach. And like I said, I am a farmer. So I come from this world where there's a lot of talk about how to regenerate soils, how to regenerate ecosystems through farming, but it still hasn't made its way to forestry for the most part. So let's look at the core tenets at the base that inform like this entire regime. So number one, transforming problems into solutions. And that's a big one. I'll mention it a couple of times as we look at some of the methodologies that I'm suggesting. Two, imitating, harnessing, and augmenting natural processes. So that is very much like an agricultural or organic agricultural approach. And three, identifying and emphasizing inherent variability wherever it is that you work. Nature has already expressed itself. Even a tree farm is not 100% homogeneous. We need to be able to look for the way that the land has expressed itself and work with that rather than imposing some kind of human algorithm on it. And this vision, I want you guys to just keep in mind, because I want you to take it for the rest of our talk, because this is really what we're trying to do. The vision is to ensure the forest's survival with as many of its essential functions and key organisms present until it becomes sufficiently resilient, complex, and diverse to prosper without further intervention. So we start with survival, but then we look at prosperity. So we want to get these forests to a self-sufficient place. And the means, these are both means and ends. By encouraging diversity, complexity, and resilience, we can fulfill this vision. So now let's get into the methodologies themselves. We're going to start with a very brief talk on ecological thinning because we already talked about the existing method, variable density thinning. I just want to mention one methodology that relates to the matrix part. If you remember, that's 60 to 80% of the stand that we talked about. And so when I looked at variable density thinning bodies, I felt that the existing methods and approaches for thinning the matrix were a weak link. So I've been working on developing a kind of repeatable algorithm, you can say, or just like a repeatable method or model. So I call it honeycomb matrix because if you look at the photo on the right, it looks a little bit like a bee comb, and we keep bees, and it's actually where I got the idea. It's basically a kind of decision tree, and I don't want to go into it too deeply because, like I said, thinning is such a massive problem, and it's such a massively important issue. So I'll just show a comparison between even-spaced matrix, so that's on the bottom left, and the honeycomb matrix on the right. And the idea is to basically maximize the variability in the matrix as well, which, like I said, is something that I identify as a shortcoming. But again, even without this, existing thinning treatments do a very good job. Existing variable density thinning treatments do a very good job. So let's just skip over this. So now we're getting to one of the most important parts of this talk, and that's the problem of continuity. Like I mentioned, when we looked at the limitations, continuity is a huge problem, and that's the single most repeated limitation that any kind of researcher in these LSSEs talked about. So I want to introduce you to the concept of time release mortality mechanisms. So first, I want to talk about what I call calibrated belts. And well, the origin is actually, it's quite a simple concept. Well, most agricultural and kind of land related things are simple in nature. So the inspiration for this actually came from the neglectful ex-landowners of where I live now. So as I was contemplating this problem of how to do a single treatment that can remain effective for longer, I came across a tree that the previous owners of the land tied a rope around. I don't know why, for what purpose, it doesn't matter. But what happened then, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's something that you can see every now and again. If you tie something, a rope around a tree, that tree is going to die. So I felt a light bulb going on in my head, and I thought, let's see if there's something we can do to use this. And it took some time, but this is where it is now. And this is still in the conceptual phase. There's not an experiment array for this yet, but we're getting there. So they're basically thick straps that increasingly inhibit vascular flow until full restriction. So the idea is you just install these straps, the tree grows and grows until it strangles itself, basically. And that will kill the tree in the end. And there's another method. But before that, I just want to say that the interesting thing about using belts is that you can calibrate mortality to schedule when the tree is going to die. So depending on the growth rate of the tree, how much slack you leave in the belt will determine when the tree is going to start getting strangled and when the tree is going to die. So in the next slide, we'll go into how a wide kind of ecosystem implementation of this will look like, or a landscape scale implementation. This is just a concept. And another method is partial girdling. So rather than doing an instant snag like we saw way back in the existing methodologies where you girdle the whole tree, you can also just do a partial girdling. We won't go into that too much. If you want, again, bring it up in the discussion and I can go into it more deeply. So let's look at how we use these time release mortality mechanisms to create mortality cohorts. So let's take an example. Let's say we have our typical tree farm stand. It's very dense. I don't know. It's probably somewhere between 700, 800, 1,000 stems per hectare by the time it's 30 or 40, which is the average age of a forest in BC. So let's say our initial thinning is down to, we take the forest down to 300 stems per hectare. And that's a pretty moderate thinning. I know it sounds like a lot, but this is actually a pretty moderate thinning. It's on the light end even. And let's say that after the thinning, the growth rate that we're going to be getting will be 1 centimeter per year. And that's diameter growth of the tree. And that our goal will be to reduce the density to 150 stems per hectare over the next 20 years. So we do the initial thinning and we install these mechanisms at the same time. And our goal will be to get this reduction from 300 to 150 over 20 years with 5 mortality cohorts. So let's look how we'll do that. So initial thinning, like I said, 300 stems per hectare. Cohort number 1. So those will be instant snags. Those are going to be trees that we girdle completely. And it takes between a year and three years, depending on the size of the tree, for those trees to die. And let's say we do 30 stems in each of our cohorts. So 30 stems that die a year to 3 years and after the treatment. And it's really important to emphasize that when I say a number of years here, I don't mean when you install the belts. I mean, everything is installed during this one treatment that we do. This is the number of years that it takes for the tree to die. So cohort number 2 will be close fitting calibrated belts. Let's say that's another 30 stems, and those are 30 trees that will die in 3 to 5 years. And then cohort number 3, 5 centimeters of slack in the belt. Those are 30 stems that will die in 8 to 10 years. You start to get the gist, I think. And then cohort 4, 10 centimeters, 30 stems, 13 to 15 years. And cohort 5, 15 centimeters slack, 30 stems, 20 years. So in 20 years, we're going to get our overstory down from 300 to 150. So let's look at what this allows us to do. So first of all, the typical forest we have is somewhere between 20 and 80, but really as we harvest more and more of our older forests and rotation lengths get shorter and shorter, the typical forest is somewhere between 30 and 50. And if you treat a forest continually from that kind of age, let's say 40, by the time it's 80, it'll mostly be out of the woods. It'll be somewhat resilient, biodiverse, complex. It'll be in that self-sufficient state that we talked about in the vision part. So you can see there's a gap here. So about 40 years, and most of the thinning treatments, even the most severe ones, will only remain effective for about 20 years. So when we use these mortality cohorts, we can basically do a single treatment that remains effective for double the duration, 40 years. And those extra 20 years will be enough to get us to that point where the forest is out of the woods when it comes to its danger of burning down or basically collapse, ecological collapse. So it's a single treatment that gets us there. And like I said, when you look at the scale of the problem, I think that I can't overstate how important it is to try and find treatments that with one treatment we can get there, because it's millions of hectares, and even doing a single treatment on that scale will require an entirely new economy, and it's unfathomable. It's like a dream, but still, it's a very distant vision, but it's essential. So multiple treatments are really quite unfeasible on that scale. And another advantage of this is that, like I said, 300 is a pretty moderate or light thinning. When you do this, you don't need to get into the realm of really aggressive thinning so that you get another year or 2 or 3 of benefit. So it allows for a more moderate initial thinning. Another advantage is that unlike doing multiple thinnings, when you get these spikes, you get canopy closure and then you open it, and canopy closure and you open it. Here you get a more consistent canopy opening rate, which will also allow all of the associated benefits, which is biodiversity, hydrology, fire resilience, to be more consistent rather than more of a spiking and collapse. Another advantage is that we're getting a more natural mortality pattern. So trees that die like this, as they get strangled, and they basically die almost like a tree would die from disease. It's a slow and natural kind of decline. It's not the instant death of cutting a tree down. And that's important because it's also slow and gradual fuel contributions. So these trees will drop their needles slowly. They'll drop their branches slowly. They'll die in more variable rates, and that's important. And another thing we're doing is we're basically projecting an investment into the future here. We're creating a coarse woody debris bank. So a tree that we leave, let's say at cord 5, 15 centimeters of slack, in 20 years, that tree could be double the diameter and maybe 4 times the mass. So we're basically, rather than taking the tree down right now, we're giving it the time to become a far more valuable and long living and enduring contribution to the ecology. So this is the concept, and we can go into it more in more length in the discussion. Now let's get into another really important element, fuel management. And that's another one of the elements that I identified as being a missing link in the existing methods. So let's have a look at that. Before we start to talk about the methods, let's just look at the fuel situation in our forests and have a quick overview. So the bad news is that we have very overdense forests with extreme fuel loadings, whether it's ladder fuels, ground fuels, canopy fuels. And our forests are also critically deficient, of course, with debris and soil organic matter or carbon, as we've discussed. And of course, they're also hydrologically dysfunctional, as we've discussed. So what's the good news? Well, the good news is that these first two can actually alleviate the last two. So these forests, they're very good. They excel at making wood. So if we take this wood that is a problem at the moment, it creates canopy closure, it's going to be fuel, it deprives any other organism of resources. Take that wood and invest it into this carbon bank, we can harness all of the benefits that coarse woody debris in old growth forests provides. So this is an example of taking a problem and turning it into a solution that we discussed in the core tenets part. So before let's just have a quick look at the existing way and the existing model. So at the moment, what's done after a thinning, and you have to do a fuel management treatment after a thinning, because if you don't, you're actually going to be increasing your chance for a fire rather than decreasing it. So let's look at the existing model for that. It's a combination usually of harvesting of some of the wood and slash burning the rest. So first of all, it's really important to say that it works. It does what it sets out to do, works in some ways, but there's also some serious problems. And I just wanted to say, so what it does well is that it provides minerals to depleted soils, and we're neutralizing the fuels. So it's better than nothing. It's still better than just leaving all the fuels on the ground haphazardly after a thinning treatment. So what are the problems with slash burning though? So we're losing whatever precious little carbon and nitrogen we have in our forests. We're burning it. It's all just going to the atmosphere. Some minerals stay, but not the carbon and nitrogen, which are crucial. And we lose the coarse woody debris and all of its countless associated benefits. So we're basically squandering the precious little that these forests have, which is a crying shame, really, when you look at the state of our forests. And then, of course, carbon emissions, smoke. We already have so much smoke in our lives these days, and pollutants. It's just more of the same, and it's a problem. And also, the benefits are quite short term. So if you look at the contribution of ash to soil mineralization, it's really a relatively short term benefit because ash is highly leachable, especially when there are not large carbon bodies to absorb it. Of course, pollution of waterways is another big one. So these ashes, they're highly leachable. There's nothing to absorb them. They just end up in the waterways. And it's also difficult to implement. So in the lens of climate change, the droughts and the temperature extremes are getting more and more severe. So the window for safely slash burning is becoming smaller. Like here in the Comox Valley, we only had 6 days this year when the logging companies could burn, and they only get to a fraction of what they need to burn. And of course, community interface, you can't always burn when there's communities quite close. So that's the existing method. And I want to introduce you to a concept that I call biological fuel management. So the core premise, and I'll read it out, is that natural decomposers, primarily fungi, can safely and effectively neutralize hazardous fuel loads while providing countless long-lasting ecological benefits. So this is the ecological climate adaptation from the title. So we're taking care of the fuels, but we're doing that in a way that also takes care of other elements. That's why it's also holistic. It's taking care of the hydrology and the ecology. So all of these ideas have a very deep agricultural foundation. So what we're aiming to do here is replace fire with augmented decomposition. So techniques like composting, it's been around for a long time. Porous high surface layers, so mulching to retain moisture and provide nutrients, and live plant cover, so cover cropping, and creating new mycelial colonization vectors, so creating new routes for the fungi to work on these fuels so that they can neutralize them more quickly. And that's a little bit like inoculating, like if you're going to inoculate a log for growing edible mushrooms, for example, or using compost teas. So let's look at the first method. It's the assembled nurse log, which is it's really the first method that I've worked on. And the reason it being is that I identified this fuel management problem to be something that, as I worked on my forests, on my land, and I didn't want to slash burn, um, I realized I had to come up with something myself. It's basically like a compost pile. So you can see there's like a lasagna of logs and wood chips topped by a branch of layers. And on top of that, there's another thick layer of wood chips. So this is the process of making it. Step one, we're making this lasagna. Step two, this is the completed pour. Step three, the branches are layered. And step four, wood chips are layered on top of it again. So the origin of this, like I said, is the work on my land. And there's a part of my forest where I didn't want to harvest anything. I wanted to experiment with what happens when everything that I thin is then reinvested into the forest. And like I said, I didn't have any options because the existing methods only include harvesting and slash burning. So basically, I had to develop this method to be able to do what I set out to do, which is leave all the fuels in the forest without creating a fire hazard. So this is designed to imitate large nurse logs from smaller material. And these kinds of coarse woody debris inputs, like these nurse logs, I've mentioned it many times, and it would take a whole lecture to just talk about their benefits, but there are countless benefits when it comes to hydrology, biology, ecology. So we're imitating them. Because it can take 200 to 300 years for a forest, for an undisturbed forest, to develop really large coarse woody debris. And this focuses on the decomposition of small to medium coarse woody debris, which are the most flammable categories. So this is really, when you look at the fuel management effect, this focuses on preventing ignition. And like I mentioned, new mycelial colonization vectors in the beginning. And so here we introduce a top to bottom decomposition vector and not just bottom to top. So if you have a log on the ground, it's going to decompose from the bottom up. The fungi are going to reach in from the moist ground and the top of the tree is dry. Here, we retain so much moisture that we introduce a new colonization vector from the top to the bottom, and you get this kind of mycelial sandwich, basically, and that maximizes the decomposition pressure. Because of course, a fuel management method has to be safe. And to me, this seems like alchemy, or again, transforming problems into solution. We're taking this overdense structure of the forest and these dry, fine fuels, and we're making a substrate out of them that retains moisture and prevents the ignition of the larger materials. And alchemy is the art of transforming, like, impossible transformations between things. It's kind of a form of magic, I guess. And this to me seems like a kind of magic. And again, the benefits, like I mentioned, of course, with the debris are soil building, its habitat, and lifeboating, for example, is the giving a small habitat niche to an organism that would otherwise disappear, and they can survive in a small pocket to later spread. And then hydrology, of course. Let's look at another method, the mycelial graph. So the origin of this method is a walk with my good friend and third generation forester, Eric Picula. And we walked somewhere where we saw a tree that Eric knew fell down 7 years before we came there. And I was shocked when he said it was 7 years, because I thought it just fell down because it looked pristine. And that got me thinking about the problem, because our forests are running out of coarse woody debris banks that we've inherited from the old growth forests. And we haven't put anything, we've only been taking for over a century. So I thought to myself, well, if we want, start providing some of these ecological benefits before 20 years pass, we need to find a method. And I was thinking about mushroom farming and how they inoculate logs. And I was wanting to find something that we can apply in the forest. And then I couldn't figure it out quite. And one night I had a dream, and in my dream I was in my backyard with a chainsaw cutting these crevices, and I woke up and I just put my chainsaw pants and boots on, and I was still in my pajamas, and my partner thought I was crazy, and I just ran to the forest to try it and see if it works. And that's where it originated from. And this focuses on the accelerated decomposition of larger coarse woody debris, which is not really a problem in terms of ignition, but if you have a huge continuum of that can definitely exacerbate an existing fire. And the premise of this method is to create an ideal fungal habitat in the core of this log, so to provide the moisture, the nutrients, and the drainage that the fungi need to prosper. There's three parts. So there's an inoculation. The mycelial graft is basically an inoculation. So you can see on the photo on the right, a volunteer is stuffing this crevice with this mix. And the first part is indigenous. It's old growth inoculant. So it's basically material from decomposed old logs or nurse logs or stumps. The second part is indigenous soil right at that site. And the third part are nitrogen rich fresh wood chips with a lot of needles in them. And that's basically like the perfect inoculation and fungal diet. And it's a new colonization vector. Rather than a log decomposing from the outside in and over many, many years, the fungi grow cell by cell. Here, we're basically grafting, that's why it's called a graft, the mycelium into the core of the wood. And then it starts to decompose from the inside out, which again maximizes the decomposition pressure. And this is a method that I think, when it comes to hydrology, can have an enormous impact. Because if you get many, many large logs that are starting to decompose, laying perpendicular to the direction of your slope, and they start to sag as they decompose and adhere to the ground, they basically create dams, natural dams. So this is kind of like a nature-based solution, which is a kind of hot topic. And this is a way to accelerate these benefits. And I think that on a large-scale watershed implementation, it can have a large role to play when it comes to preventing droughts, preventing floods, holding moisture. So I just want to mention, regarding these two methodologies, there's quite an extensive experiment array that has been set up with Transition Salt Spring, which is a wonderful organization that I mentioned, and I'm working with them. And so they have an experiment site on the Mount Maxwell watershed, which provides 40% of Salt Spring's drinking water. And they call it the Climate Adaptation Research Lab. They're doing a lot of work there to see how different methods can affect the ability of these forests to withstand climatic pressures. And when I got in touch with them, they were planning their thinning treatment, and they were still looking at the fuel management options, and they were interested in collaborating and implementing the assembled nurse log and mycelial graft. So it was quite a community effort over a weekend, which of course we planned for months, but over one weekend we had 20 to 40 volunteers. Here there's a quick video. So this is on the Mount Maxwell watershed, and this is just half of the people. So on the second day, there was a second group. You can see Dr. Pierre Minot there, and there are many volunteers from Transition Salt Spring and from just the island. There's high schoolers, there's university students, there's ecologists, biologists. It was really wonderful to see people working together, restoring forests like that. And the way that we're assessing the success of these methodologies is by using decomposition gauges. So we basically use paint stir sticks. So you'll see in this video. So what this volunteer is doing, she's inserting a decomposition gauge. It's a paint stir. We've individually weighed each of them. We've dried them, weighed them, and labeled them so that we know exactly which one we're pulling out. And when we pull them out, after a given amount of time, we're going to be weighing them again. And the amount of weight that it's lost is the amount of material that's been digested by the fungi and the other organisms. So this is a way to assess the success of these methods. And we've created quite a lot of repetitions. So there's 6 assembled nurse logs, about 100 mycelial grafts. So we're already undergoing a pretty serious experimentation to see how effective and safe these methods are. So there's some encouraging early signs that I've been finding here on my land. So first of all, this is a log that when another tree fell, it was knocked out of an assembled nurse log. And it was one of the logs on the top. It's only been in there for 6 months, and it's on the top. So I'm sure that the ones in the core are even more decomposed. But here you can see there's significant fungal colonization, even on this large log. So that really made me happy. Another something that really lifted my spirit was finding these amphibians, these frogs, in the wood chips. So we talked about lifeboating. So this is an example of how certain vulnerable species that depend upon year-round moisture benefit from these structures. Another photo here shows some wood lice in action, starting to actively break down a large log right next to the crevice. And the third one here is you can see a cedar and many Douglas fir seedlings doing quite well on a pretty new assembled nurse log. So their ability to sustain life and be like a nurse log in that plants can grow on them almost immediately is also another really encouraging sign. So another part that I will talk about briefly, but I'm very interested in is ash collection initiatives. And I see it as a way to complete a cycle of reciprocity. We take so much from these forests and we give so little back. So, we'll never take the carbon and the nitrogen and everything else back, but there's a large percentage, or maybe it's not large, there's a significant percentage of wood that's burnt in wood stoves, especially in rural communities close to these forests. And many of the essential minerals that are missing, like calcium, magnesium, and many others, are present there in high concentrations. So if we have these collection initiatives where people get rid of this thing that they generally don't use, some gardeners use, most people just get rid of it and take it back to the forest, that's a way to remineralize our soil. And you can see on the photo on the left, it's being incorporated into an assembled nurse log. And that way, we're going to really slow the rate in which it leaches. So we're not going to get the same pollution of waterways. So now we're getting to the fourth and final part of this regime. And the fourth and final element is biodiversity. So underplanting, we've already talked about, and that's a big part. There's also two other parts. The main one I want to talk about are biological agents. So this element actually has a lot of interface. All of these methods are interconnected, but this one is the most connected to everything else. So let's look at biological agents and what they are. So let's start with thinning agents. So I divide them into three categories. And the reason I differentiate the species that we underplant, just general biodiversity from biological agents, is that these biological agents are species that I believe have an essential role play. So they fulfill an essential function, and one that relates generally to the other kinds of goals that we're trying to achieve. So let's look at the thinning agent. So I want to talk about Western honeysuckle. So in this video, you can see it's a very small area. It's just between us and our neighbors. It's maybe 10 square meters. It's 2 meters by 5 maybe. And in this small area, the honeysuckle vines have strangled 5 or 6 young Douglas firs. And what that has allowed is for significant biodiversity to prosper here in a place that would have been completely dominated by Douglas fir generation. So there's a maple you can see there in the back. There's here you can see a pine. There's what else is in there? There's a Sitka spruce. There's a cedar. There's some ocean spray. So basically, the idea would be to implement these types of vines in areas where we want to postpone regeneration. So if you have a large gap and you don't want it to close in again with Douglas firs after a thinning treatment, we can get these in place and they can control their regeneration. And this is just a tiny area, but these vines have done an incredible amount of work on Honey Grove. There's a whole part of the land that is just so biodiverse. And my hypothesis is that one of the contributing factors for that is that the honeysuckle got established there. So there's a much higher bud understory presence. There's a much better tree composition there. There's a much better structure. It's much less closed. So I think these can have a really important role to play. Fuel management agents are the second category. So let's look at the Pacific blackberry at coarse woody debris specialists. So basically species that excel at growing on nurse logs and on stumps and thatching ants. So these are the three that we're going to be briefly looking at. So here on the left, you can see an assembled nurse log that has been almost completely swallowed by the Pacific blackberry. So Pacific blackberry excels at growing on elevated surfaces, and it provides many ecological benefits. So it provides pollinator feed, which I didn't mention pollinators, but pollinators are so important, and forestry doesn't generally look at the effect on pollinators at all. So this is basically like a cover crop. So this takes the concept of biological fuel management to its final conclusion, where we're truly making nurse logs out of these assembled nurse logs. So we're using organisms that can cover them, prosper in them. The roots growing into them can accelerate their decomposition. They can shade them, increase. It's basically the kind of ideal moisture seal. That's why we use cover crops in many ways, to protect and contain moisture. And on the right, you can see a very large colony of thatching ants. They're present everywhere in BC, or in most places in BC. I have 3 colonies on my land, and I believe that, and again, these are more conceptual points, so there still isn't an experiment array for these, but I believe that these thatching ants can play a crucial role if we can introduce a few germs of colonies after a thinning treatment. Because what they collect, you can see in the picture, are the finest fuels. So even if the mass isn't heavy, the effect on probability of ignition could be critical. So introducing these kinds of species alongside our fuel management can really take things to the biological level. And we won't go into this, but I just want to mention the role of microorganisms. And on the farm here, I work a lot with fermentations, so compost teas, inoculations, and I believe that we can use these kinds of methods to increase the portion of nitrogen-fixing bacteria in our assembled nurse logs, for example, and we can use these fermentations and inoculations to restore biodiversity on the soil level, which is another really, just like with agriculture, it's another really important element. So with regenerative agriculture, what people are realizing is that if you have that microorganism biodiversity, they do essential functions, and that no soil can be healthy without this kind of biodiversity. So it's the same with forests. I think that this is a whole new frontier that we're going to need to get good at reestablishing this type of microorganism biodiversity. And the last method we're going to talk about are microsnags, and we'll just go over it really quickly. It's quite simple, really. It's just tall stumping, and these tall stumps provide certain snag benefits. They're not as effective as a full height snag, but when I fall a tree on my land, I always fall it like that. So why? I mean, it's a small, but it's a cumulative effect, and the benefits that it gives help to catalyze biological processes. Of course, I wish I had snags that old growth forests have, but I don't. So this is a way to provide some forage for woodpeckers, some forage for borers, and habitat for these kinds of insects. And it also is a way to provide kind of an elevated spore release platform for fungi. So spores can more effectively be carried by wind when the mushroom is not laying on the ground. So that's another method, and I won't get into it in too much depth. And here we are, we're at the summary. So just a couple more minutes and we'll be in our discussion. So I'll bring up this table from back when about the limitations of existing methodologies, because we're not going to answer all the questions, but I want you to, as you go from today, just ask yourself if you think that some of these methodologies could be effective in bridging some of these gaps. So continuity, we talked about it, about the time release mortality and the mortality cohorts. Of course, woody debris volume, so our fuel management is highly focused on that. Soil health, so there's the ashes, there's the species that we underplant, there's all of the carbon contributions from the assembled nurse logs, the mycelial grafts. Hydrology, again, highly affected by carbon, and of course woody debris. The growth of the largest trees, I believe, if we use these ashes, if we use these coarse woody debris replicant structures, we hold more moisture, we remineralize the soil, we reintroduce biodiversity to the soil, I think we're going to start seeing accelerated growth in the largest trees as well. And finally, fuel management, well, we went into it quite in depth. And I just want to bring this up because, like I said, this is at the core of this whole body of work. And these photos are here again because they're just such a stark contrast. And I want you to remember that this is, in the end, what we're fighting for. It's to take these types of forests and try to get to these kind of healthy forests. So what's next? Just a quick look at a few next steps. So first of all, I want to expand and establish new experiment arrays. So there's some of these methods that are already implemented here on Honey Grove. Some are implemented at the Climate Adaptation Research Lab. Raincoast Conservation Foundation are interested in also implementing some of these methods and making experiment arrays. So that's always in the process. So Transition Salt Spring has also been interested in a prescription. So there's a new site we're going to be treating there, and they're interested in what I propose. And then we're looking at implementing these kinds of methodologies on a larger scale to put a experiment array together that sees how they all work together. Because really, when I say that this is a holistic regime, I mean it. Everything that I think about relating to these problems is how things are interconnected and how different factors affect each other. Hydrology affects soil, soil affects hydrology, and so on. So Raincoast Conservation Foundation, I've already mentioned this, they've acquired a new forest, and they're interested in implementing these methods in these forests as well, and we'll be discussing that in the near future. And there's an article that I'll share the link for that was published on many of these methods, and they delve more deeply into them. And there's going to be a second feature that includes what's missing. And the last one is I'm very interested in finding a large scale site for demonstration here in the Comox Valley. And yeah, I would really love to to find a way to make that a reality. But yeah, this is it. So this is everything for today. And